What is your name?
Levi S. Peterson.
And tell us a bit about your ancestors.
Well, my middle name is Savage, and on my Savage, my mother's side, Savage, that's my mother's maiden name. The family goes quite a way back, in fact, to John Savage, who was a private soldier in the General Wolfe's army at the Battle of Quebec, and who, after the battle, deserted, showing that the line I come from has a lack of fidelity to England. But at any rate...
Around what year was that?
1769.
Okay.
And my Savage ancestors moved from Massachusetts to Ohio, to New York, to Ohio, to Michigan, and along the way became Mormons and ended up in the Exodus of 47. In fact, my first ancestor of my name, Levi Savage Sr., arrived in Salt Lake Valley in 1847, but a month or so after the Vanguard Company. And his son, Levi Savage Jr., went on a mission to Siam, was in the Mormon battalion, was in the Willie's handcart disaster, and married his two stepdaughters. So he was a full-scale polygamist and served time in the penitentiary. So everything that could happen to a pioneer Mormon happened to him. But my Peterson ancestors are a little tamer. My Peterson ancestors migrated in 1862, so they arrived in Salt Lake before the railroad came, and so I qualify for membership in the Daughters of the Utah Pioneers, except for gender. But at any rate, that kind of heritage, of course, explains why I remain so firmly attached to Mormonism, I think.
Absolutely. So tell us a bit about your parents.
Well, my father was Joseph Peterson. He was born in Lehigh and was called on being a graduate of BY Academy, he was called on a teaching mission to Snowflake, Arizona. And my mother, Lydia Jane Savage, daughter of Levi M. Savage, was born in a nearby town called Woodruff, where her parents had migrated on a call from the church as pioneers. And my father was 19 years older than my mother and taught her in the academy, but she got into an unhappy marriage and divorced soon, and was a grass widow for a number of years. And my father's...
What does that mean, grass widow?
Divorced.
Okay.
Having no husband because of divorce.
Okay.
And and my father's first wife, Amanda, died, and after a period they corresponded and got married. He having 6 children and she 2 daughters. My dad had 4 sons, 2 daughters. My mother had 2 daughters. And they married, combining their composite family, and had 5 sons together. And I was the last, so 13. So I came from a big family, and there was no distinction between those who, for me, between my step siblings and my full siblings, except for the fact that step siblings were all old enough to be my mother or father, and I tended to regard them as uncles or aunts for a while. But as I grew up, I came into full fellowship with them.
But it wasn't like they went away
No, they were around in my growing up, and many of their children, my nephews and nieces, were my full peers, not only in age but in camaraderie. I bonded with them, and they're very much like brothers and sisters to me also. So I come from a large, intense family. The familial bond is very strong in it. Still, there's still big family reunions, and I go to them. The great multitude of descendants of my father and mother and Aunt Amanda, they were 90% of them are active believing Mormons, and the other 10% are backsliders, and I provide something of a bridge between them because I get along comfortably with both sides of the family, but the backsliders show up at funerals and reunions, and while the believing side of the family is somewhat ill at ease with them, trying hard to make them feel comfortable but not quite managing, they still come, and I fraternize with them. But at any rate, a big composite family is what I come from.
Okay, lots of siblings. So, so what was your childhood like?
Well, I was raised in fairly primitive conditions without realizing it, because Snowflake, Arizona in the 1930s, I was born in 1933, in the middle of the Depression. My father had a salary because of his teaching at the high school, and we had something of a little farm, and everybody else in town was equally poor, so I didn't grow up with a sense of poverty, but Snowflake had a population of perhaps only 900 people, and it was, I suppose, one of the largest towns in northern Arizona. There were 2 or 3 others on the railroad bigger, but it was range country and very little water, and Snowflake was on a creek that ran year-round, and that's why it was there. I started grade school in this first grade. It was an 8-year grade school and a 4-year high school. And the grade school was across the street from my house, and the high school was just a block further away. I felt comfortably a part of not only my family but the town. And I remark in my autobiography on how Snowflake had fostered in my childhood a piratical fraternity, and that was a figurative term referring to me and my schoolmates and my other friends, the friends of my older brothers and so on. And my point was that we were ordinary Mormon children and Christian children, and believed as our parents believed, and knew what was right and wrong, and we cheerfully disobeyed what was right and wrong and went about doing evil.
Do you have any stories of a thing or two that might...
Well, when coming home from a movie, urinate in the dust, write our names in the dust at night. There was a town movie because if your parents paid their ward budget, the family got to go to movies Wednesdays nights and Saturdays. And so, as I say, coming home from the movie on a Wednesday night, writing my name in dust with urine, and irrigating at night, seeing a skunk emerging from a ditch, throwing the dog on it just to see what would happen. One time my friends and I were, 2 friends and I were loitering in our cow shed after a sacrament meeting on a Sunday afternoon, and one of my nephews, a little younger, was on top of the cow shed, and one of my friends walked out of the cow shed, and the nephew above urinated on him. and the friend had a magical power. He could hold his foreskin tight and build up urinary pressure and eject a trajectory of urine, I suppose, 15 feet. He did that often coming home from movies and so on, but this time he decided to punish my nephew, who simply stood on the roof of the shed with his arms akimbo, jeering at him. And so my friend ginned up his shotgun and fired, and at that point I peered around the corner of the shed with my eye, and splat, it hit me squarely in the eye. Anyway, sorry about that. That's what I meant, kind of an evil childhood. That kind of incident was more or less commonplace, and that nephew, incidentally, is a very pious man, and he won't own up to that ever having happened, but it did.
Tell us just briefly about the conditions when you say humble circumstances, but you didn't know it. For someone who lives in the 21st century, maybe a young kid, they might have even no sense of scope of comparing their lives today to what. Do you have a story or two or an example of what life for you would have been like that may contrast kind of heavily with what kids today might experience?
Well, our house had a large living room, an added front room that had a hardwood floor in it and was our fancy room. An indoor bathroom. I did grow up with an indoor bathroom, which not everybody in town did, and a very small kitchen, 2 bedrooms. One of the bedrooms was heated with a wood stove. The dining room had a wood stove. The bathroom had a small wood stove. The kitchen, the bedroom the one bedroom I and 4 brothers shared, had no stove in it, and we certainly didn't have central heating. And though northern Arizona is generally sunny and somewhat warmer than northern parts, the plains of Arizona are susceptible to air masses from Canada coming down through the Great Plains and looping around into Arizona. We had temperatures at 30 below. My dad he kept a weather station, and so I was aware of that. So we had to sleep under heavy loads of quilts, and my mother would fix a flat iron on a cold night to put in bed, wrap it in a towel and put it in bed with us. And early morning, my mother would get out of bed. My father was older, and she built the fire in the living room and in the dining room and the kitchen, and there were no other fires in the house commonly during the week. All winter long, you lived in those 2 rooms, including a very small kitchen. I was born in that house, so was a brother, and another brother was born in the kitchen before it was converted to a kitchen. So I guess that's self-sufficient. And
what about like farm labor, manual labor,
Well, we had our chores. We had chopper wood, get the chips, feed the chickens, feed the pig, milk the cows. If we were, depending on our age. And my dad wouldn't do much of that. He was older, and he had my brother Charles milking cows at age 7. I was a little older before I got into it, but I could milk a cow and milked a lot of them. But we did our chores, and my father had a small farm on the creek, and we were required to do our share of hoeing and hay tromping, hauling hay, and so on in the summers. Ordinary farm chores in the winter. So we had those.
Tell us a bit about the personality of your parents, your mom and your dad, or either one, and how that was an important part of shaping your formative years.
Well, my father was I think a very intelligent man who I think toyed with getting an advanced degree in anthropology, and in fact he moved his first family when he was married to his first wife to the University of California at Berkeley to pursue a degree in anthropology, but he left and came back to Arizona and hired on permanently there at the high school after a year and a half because he said from ill health, but he also, I think, was fleeing from disbelief. I think he was maybe
in the LDS Church
and Christianity. I think perhaps my father was instinctive skeptic, but he struggled against it and basically he did remain an active Mormon all his life, and in fact he made a strong contribution to the building up of northern Arizona and the church there because of his educational activities. He became county school superintendent in it after a while and was very instrumental there. And he spent his last 20 years teaching English in the high school. He'd been a math and science teacher earlier, but a very intelligent man. But he had a hobby, an interest in the Indians of northern Arizona that he pursued extensively. And that's why in my autobiography I called him a failed anthropologist. I think he wanted to be, but in the end he just became an amateur anthropologist instead of a professional one. My mother was a very intelligent woman, but instinctively more faithful than my father and probably more adamant in obedience. She was somewhat a mixture of severity and in demanding obedience and in affection. I'd never doubted my mother's love for me ever. And that's a nice thing to grow up with.
You were her baby boy, right?
I was her baby boy, and I think she felt that way. She was passionate about all her children, very much a mother in Zion. But my father died when I was 9 at age 70, and my mother continued to raise the four sons that were at home. Her first child by my father died at age 3, but the other four of us grew up, and my mother cared for us even after my father's death. So she was a sturdy woman, and she did that. As I said, she would get up early to do that, build the fires and get the housework going, because my father, he was 50 when he married her, so she was 30. But I think I had very. My father was not a person with whom I engaged deeply in an emotional way. He loved me and I loved him, and he was a model for me. But my mother was much more influential on my character, and for, I suppose, in the eyes of some people, both good and bad, in that I think my conflict with Mormonism has a lot to do with the conflict with her.
So give us some examples, some stories maybe on both sides of that equation that might illustrate that tension.
I think we're moving toward maybe an area, the time in my life that became significant when I was older. Till I left for college, I don't think I was. I was an obedient Mormon, and I considered myself a happy young Mormon, and I still think I was. But when I went off to college and was at the point of trying to shift out of a adolescent mentality into an adult mentality at age 18, I suppose I started on the road then toward disbelief and revolt against my religion. You know, in the introduction, opening to my autobiography, I speak of my vexed and vexing relationship with Mormonism, and it has seemed that way to me ever since my early college years. That's when it began.
Was there a stage of just pure belief and devotion and dogmatic zealotry on your part?
Yes, indeed. In fact, I recall my very first religion class at BYU, Book of Mormon. I was not even 18 yet. The professor bore his testimony, and I had a distinct sensation of doubt, which frightened me. And other circumstances were involved that I narrate in my autobiography, but I immediately began searching for a testimony of my own. And I was on a 3-year track. My 3 years of college before I went on my mission, I was in an intense quest for my own testimony. I ended that era by going on the mission and then shortly deciding I not only didn't have a testimony, I didn't believe anymore, which made my mission complicated. But my early college years were that period, and I had bouts of disbelief, which I would smother and return to my more tranquil believing state. And I was a very zealous and scrupulous keeper of the commandments. And being my mother's son, I would have had to be. I've described myself as a Mormon monk, and there's some validity to that description. I didn't manage to overcome the carnal man in myself too well, because at one point I even got so far into ardent petting with a girl, a college girl, that I henceforth thought of myself as a fornicator. And I even ended up at one point going to my bishop when I got home from my college year in the summer and confessing myself a fornicator. And he handled it well, and thank goodness, and told me not to talk about it, said I was forgiven and not talk about it with anybody else. And but in reflecting back on that, I attribute quite a bit of zealotry to myself to have induced me to do that kind of a thing that I certainly didn't want to do. I paid my tithing on the pittance of money I earned, and I fasted scrupulously, and I prayed night and morning, and I did what you're supposed to do, you see. But in later years, in delving into introspectively into my mind, I could see that a lot of what was going on was struggling between being like my mother and not being like her.
So talk about, can you tell a story or two about what that would illustrate what she was like that then made you drive towards trying in some ways to be like her and not like her? Just give us a sense for who she was and how she lived that would be, I don't know about colorful, but illustrative of what later led to tension.
When I was a little boy, one day for play, I broke a slice of bread on a plate, took it into the living room where she was polishing the wax floor and offered her, like a deacon, a plate of the broken bread. Her face was horror-stricken, and she gasped, "You must never, ever play like you're doing the sacrament." And I could see from her face and her tone of voice that the big guy upstairs was a mean one. You had to approach him with caution. And later on, I would say, in my fiction, I sought to evaluate the costs of Christian belief. One of the costs, at least in my mother's life, was, and I think numerous other Mormons, is that God dispenses His blessings at the high price of a very scrupulous and strict and uncomfortable obedience. And what might I mean by uncomfortable? In her old age, when my mother stayed with Althea and me, 6 weeks or 2 months of the year, in the spring usually, she was deaf somewhat and a little senile, not too bad, but her day-long entertainment or distraction was crocheting Afghans. And she'd do them over and over and over and give them all over the place. And everybody she was staying with, all my brothers and sisters and I, we would make sure she had her yarn, and because it was a pleasure she loved, and it made her day tolerable. Well, Sundays, however, she wouldn't do her crocheting, and they were hellish. This I can tell you because she would stamp around the house. I'd take her to church, and that helped, and she might write a letter, and she'd read some scriptures, but then she'd simply sigh and move about angrily, and I'd say, "I don't think Heavenly Father would mind if an elderly woman did a little crocheting on the Sabbath," but no way. It was not. It was her work. You weren't to work on Sunday, and that was her work. Now that's the kind of woman we're dealing with. That the costs of God's protection and benefits were high. That was my observation.
And so you in your own self felt split between trying to honor that and trying to say this discomfort maybe isn't worth it, or can't be what a God that I want to sign up to would require.
Over the long haul, I decided I'm not an irreligious man, but I do not believe in that kind of a God, and I won't. And I'm told by my Mormon confreres, well, we don't. We believe in a benign, easygoing God. And I say that is not what I'm intuiting when I go over to my gospel doctrine class. That's not what I'm intuiting. I'm feeling a lot of vibes that say you got to keep your eye on the big guy, because you got to be obedient, and obedient to a long list of things that a lot of people would think were not very important. Obedience for their own sake, for its own sake. So